The estate sale in Charleston, South Carolina was winding down when antique dealer Marcus Webb noticed something that made him stop mid-stride. Among the final items being cleared from the Ashford mansion was an ornate Victorian mirror, its silver backing tarnished with age, its elaborate wooden frame carved with roses and thorns. But it wasn't the mirror itself that caught his attention. Tucked behind the frame was a photograph, wedged so tightly that previous buyers had overlooked it entirely. The photograph was an albumen print, mounted on heavy cardboard with Ashford family November 1899, written in faded brown ink. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical Victorian family portrait. Benjamin Ashford, a distinguished gentleman in his 50s, stood behind his seated wife Margaret, while their 3 children were arranged in the formal poses characteristic of turn-of-the-century photography. Marcus had dealt in historical photographs for 20 years, and nothing about the image seemed unusual. The lighting was professional, the poses were conventional, and the formal Victorian clothing created exactly the kind of dignified family presentation that wealthy Southern families favored during that era. He almost returned the photograph to its hiding place when something in the composition made him look more carefully. Behind the family, dominating the background of the photograph, was the same ornate mirror that now sat before him. The mirror's reflection should have shown the backs of the family members and perhaps a glimpse of the photographer's equipment. Instead, the reflection showed something that would challenge Marcus's understanding of photography, reality, and the hidden secrets that some families carry across generations. The mirror reflected a different scene entirely. Where the family stood in the main photograph, the reflection showed an empty room. But in the corner of the mirrored image, clearly visible despite the sepia tones and century-old photographic chemistry, sat a young woman who bore no resemblance to anyone in the Ashford family. She wore a simple white dress, and her face held an expression of profound sadness as she stared directly out of the reflection, as if she could see through the mirror into the photographer's studio where the family was posing. Marcus purchased both the mirror and the photograph, driven by a curiosity that would soon become an obsession. Over the next several weeks, he researched the Ashford family history, hoping to identify the mysterious woman whose reflection had somehow been captured in their family portrait. What he discovered would reveal one of the darkest chapters in Charleston's antebellum history and explain how guilt, tragedy, and the weight of family secrets could manifest in ways that defied logical explanation. The Ashford family had been prominent in Charleston society since the 1820s, when Benjamin's father had established a profitable cotton trading business that had made the family wealthy enough to build their mansion on Meeting Street. The 1860 census showed that the Ashfords owned 37 enslaved people who worked both in the household and on a plantation outside the city limits. Among the enslaved individuals listed in the census records was a 20-year-old woman named Sarah, described as a house servant of mixed race, who had been responsible for the care of the Ashford children and the management of the household's domestic operations. The census entry noted that Sarah could read and write, unusual for enslaved individuals of that period, and that she had been born in the Ashford household rather than purchased from other owners. Marcus's research into Charleston's historical records revealed that Sarah had been the daughter of Benjamin Ashford's father and an enslaved woman named Mary. This made Sarah the half-sister of Benjamin Ashford, though such family relationships were rarely acknowledged publicly in antebellum Southern society. Sarah's mixed heritage and family connection had placed her in the complex position of being both enslaved property and a blood relative of her owners. The records showed that Sarah had remained with the Ashford family throughout the Civil War and Reconstruction, transitioning from enslaved status to paid domestic worker when slavery was abolished. But her story had ended tragically in 1877, when she had died under circumstances that the family had apparently taken great pains to conceal. Marcus found Sarah's death certificate in the Charleston County Archives, but the official cause of death was listed simply as consumption, the catch-all term used to describe various respiratory ailments during the 19th century. However, contemporary newspaper accounts told a different story that revealed the true circumstances of Sarah's death and explained why her reflection might have appeared in the Ashford family's 1899 portrait. According to a brief item in the Charleston Mercury, Sarah had died after being severely beaten by unknown assailants who had attacked her on her way home from the Ashford mansion. The newspaper suggested that the attack had been motivated by racial hatred, as Sarah's mixed heritage and continued association with her former owners had made her a target for violence during the turbulent years following Reconstruction. But Marcus's investigation uncovered evidence that contradicted the official account of Sarah's death. Letters preserved in the papers of a contemporary Charleston minister revealed that Sarah had been murdered not by unknown attackers, but by members of the Ashford family itself, who had discovered that she had been planning to reveal publicly her relationship to Benjamin Ashford and demand recognition as his sister. The minister's correspondence described a confrontation between Sarah and Benjamin Ashford that had taken place in the family's parlor, the same room where the 1899 portrait would later be taken. Sarah had threatened to expose the family's history of sexual exploitation and force Benjamin to acknowledge their blood relationship, demands that would have created a major scandal in Charleston's rigidly segregated society. According to the minister's account, the confrontation had ended with Benjamin Ashford striking Sarah with a fireplace poker, a blow that had proved fatal. The family had then constructed the story about unknown assailants to cover up Benjamin's crime and protect their social standing within Charleston's white society. The minister had been approached by Margaret Ashford, who had sought spiritual counsel about the murder her husband had committed. Margaret had been present during the confrontation and had been tormented by guilt over her failure to intervene or prevent Sarah's death. She had confided to the minister that Sarah's final words had been a promise that she would never rest until the truth about her relationship to the family was revealed and her death was avenged. Marcus realized that the woman in the mirror's reflection was Sarah, somehow appearing in the family's 1899 portrait as a manifestation of her promise to reveal the truth about her life and death. The photograph had captured not just the living Ashford family, but also the spiritual presence of the woman they had murdered 22 years earlier. The discovery prompted Marcus to research other historical photographs from Charleston families with similar histories of enslaved relatives and concealed family relationships. His investigation revealed that the Ashford photograph was not unique, but rather part of a pattern of supernatural manifestations that had affected numerous Charleston families with hidden histories of sexual exploitation and violence against enslaved women. Working with Dr. Rebecca Stone, a historian at the College of Charleston who specialized in slavery and family relationships in the antebellum South, Marcus documented dozens of cases where mysterious figures had appeared in family photographs, often representing enslaved women or their descendants who had been murdered, abused, or abandoned by their white relatives. Dr. Stone's research revealed that sexual relationships between white slave owners and enslaved women had created complex family networks throughout the South, relationships that had been systematically denied and concealed after the Civil War, when changed social conditions had made such connections sources of shame rather than accepted aspects of plantation life. The psychological burden of these hidden relationships and the violence that had often been used to maintain secrecy had created lasting trauma within white families who had participated in or benefited from sexual exploitation. This trauma had manifested in various ways, including the supernatural appearances that had been captured in family photographs throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Marcus and Dr. Stone collaborated on a comprehensive study of what they termed guilt manifestations in Southern family photography, documenting over 100 cases where murdered or abused enslaved women had appeared in formal portraits of the families that had victimized them. The study revealed that these supernatural manifestations had occurred most frequently during significant family events, such as weddings, christenings, and formal portrait sessions, occasions when the psychological pressure of maintaining family secrets and the emotional weight of concealed guilt had created conditions conducive to spiritual appearances. The photographs served as permanent documentation of crimes that had been covered up through official channels, creating visual evidence of violence and exploitation that had been systematically erased from historical records and family narratives. Dr. Stone's analysis revealed that the supernatural manifestations represented more than simple guilt or psychological projection. They documented the persistence of traumatic historical events and the ways that violence and exploitation had continued to influence Southern families across generations. The research attracted attention from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which was interested in the implications of supernatural photography for understanding the ongoing impacts of slavery and racial violence in American society. The organization commissioned Marcus and Dr. Stone to expand their study to include families throughout the former Confederacy. The expanded research revealed that guilt manifestations in family photography had occurred throughout the South, with particularly high concentrations in areas where sexual exploitation of enslaved women had been most common, and where violence had been used most frequently to maintain the secrecy of interracial family relationships. The photographs provided unique documentation of historical crimes that had been deliberately hidden from official records, offering insights into the scope and nature of sexual violence during slavery that could not be obtained through traditional historical sources. Marcus established an archive for collecting and preserving supernatural photographs from Southern families, creating a permanent record of manifestations that documented the hidden history of slavery and its ongoing impacts on American society. The archive attracted donations from families throughout the South who had discovered mysterious figures in their own historical photograph collections. Many donors reported that they had never understood the identity or significance of these figures until Marcus and Dr. Stone's research provided historical context for interpreting supernatural manifestations in family photography. The archive grew to include over 500 photographs showing supernatural manifestations related to slavery and racial violence, representing the largest collection of visual evidence for the hidden crimes and family relationships that had characterized the antebellum and postbellum South. Dr. Stone worked with genealogists and DNA testing services to identify the supernatural figures in family photographs, often revealing complex family relationships that had been concealed for generations. The genetic evidence frequently confirmed that mysterious figures in family portraits were indeed relatives of the white families. They appeared to be haunting. The DNA research revealed that many prominent Southern families had African American relatives whose existence had been systematically denied and erased from family histories. The supernatural photographs had preserved visual evidence of these relationships and provided opportunities for separated family lines to reconnect and acknowledge their shared heritage. Contemporary applications of the research began to emerge when modern Southern families used the findings to understand their own family histories and address the ongoing impacts of slavery and racial violence on their communities. Educational programs based on Marcus and Dr. Stone's research were developed for schools and universities throughout the South, providing frameworks for teaching about slavery and its consequences that incorporated both historical analysis and contemporary relevance. The programs used supernatural photography as a starting point for discussing difficult topics related to slavery, sexual exploitation, and racial violence, helping students understand how historical trauma could persist across generations and continue to influence contemporary social relationships. Museum exhibitions featuring the supernatural photography research attracted large audiences and generated significant discussion about the need to acknowledge and address the hidden histories that had shaped Southern society and American race relations. The exhibitions provided opportunities for families to donate photographs and share stories that had been kept secret for generations, creating public forums for discussing the ongoing impacts of slavery and working toward healing and reconciliation. As Marcus continued to research the Ashford family's history and Sarah's tragic story, he discovered additional evidence that revealed the full scope of the family's crimes and explained why Sarah's spiritual presence had been so persistent and powerful. Court records from the 1870s revealed that Sarah had not been the only victim of Benjamin Ashford's violence. He had been accused of sexual assault by several other women, both white and black, but had used his wealth and social position to avoid prosecution and maintain his reputation within Charleston society. Sarah's murder had been the culmination of a pattern of violence and exploitation that had characterized Benjamin Ashford's entire adult life, making her spiritual manifestation in the family portrait particularly significant as documentation of crimes that had never been prosecuted or acknowledged. The discovery of Benjamin Ashford's criminal history attracted attention from legal historians who were interested in the ways that wealthy white men had avoided accountability for crimes against women and minorities during the 19th century. The research revealed that Benjamin Ashford's case was typical of wealthy white Southern men who had used their social and economic power to commit crimes without consequences, creating patterns of violence and exploitation that had been systematically protected by legal and social institutions. Marcus's investigation had meanwhile attracted international attention when the story of Sarah's supernatural manifestation was featured in academic conferences on historical trauma and its ongoing impacts on contemporary society. Researchers from universities in Europe, Africa, and other regions where colonial exploitation had created similar patterns of violence and concealment expressed interest in applying supernatural photography analysis to their own studies of historical trauma and family relationships. The international research collaborations revealed that supernatural manifestations in family photography were not limited to the American South, but had occurred in various cultural contexts where sexual exploitation, violence, and family secrets had created lasting psychological and spiritual trauma. Comparative studies of supernatural photography from different regions and time periods revealed universal patterns in how historical trauma manifested across generations and how the psychological burden of concealed crimes could create conditions conducive to spiritual appearances in family documentation. The research had practical applications for contemporary efforts to address historical trauma and promote healing and reconciliation in communities that had been affected by systematic violence and exploitation. Truth and reconciliation commissions in various countries began incorporating supernatural photography research into their investigations, recognizing that such evidence could provide insights into historical crimes that had been deliberately concealed from official records. The integration of supernatural photography analysis into formal historical investigations represented a significant development in understanding how evidence of historical crimes could be preserved and recovered even when official documentation had been destroyed or suppressed. As Marcus reflected on the years of research that had grown from his discovery of Sarah's reflection in the Ashford family mirror, he realized that the investigation had revealed profound truths about American history and the ways that violence and exploitation had shaped family relationships across generations. The research had demonstrated that some crimes were so significant that they created lasting impacts that could persist beyond the lifetimes of both perpetrators and victims, manifesting in ways that demanded acknowledgement and justice even decades or centuries after the original violence had occurred. Sarah's appearance in the Ashford family's 1899 portrait had served as permanent testimony to crimes that had been covered up through official channels, creating visual evidence that had preserved her story for future generations who could provide the recognition and justice that had been denied during her lifetime. The investigation had established supernatural photography as a valuable tool for recovering hidden histories and understanding the ongoing impacts of historical trauma on contemporary society, providing new approaches for addressing the legacies of violence and exploitation that continued to influence American race relations. Marcus's discovery had revealed that some family photographs contained evidence of historical crimes that demanded acknowledgement and justice, and that the spiritual manifestations captured in these images represented more than curiosities or anomalies, but rather important testimony about American history and its ongoing impacts on contemporary society. The mirror that had reflected Sarah's image in the Ashford family portrait became a symbol of the ways that truth could persist and demand recognition even when official institutions and family narratives had conspired to conceal and deny historical crimes. Sarah's reflection would forever serve as testimony to the violence and exploitation that had characterized slavery and its aftermath, providing permanent evidence that some injustices were too significant to be buried by time, wealth, or social privilege. The 1899 photograph had evolved from a simple family portrait into one of the most important pieces of evidence for understanding how historical trauma could persist across generations and manifest in ways that demanded acknowledgement, justice, and healing for both individual families and American society as a whole. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Marcus received contact from Dr. Angela Washington, a professor of African American Studies at Howard University, who had been following his research through academic publications. Dr. Washington possessed what she believed to be related photographic evidence that could expand understanding of supernatural manifestations beyond the Ashford case and reveal the true scope of guilt manifestations in post-Civil War Southern photography. Dr. Washington had been conducting her own research into what she termed spectral witnesses, deceased enslaved individuals who appeared in family photographs of their former owners, serving as permanent testimony to crimes that had been systematically erased from official historical records. Her collection included over 200 authenticated cases from across the former Confederacy, each documenting supernatural appearances that could be connected to specific instances of violence, exploitation, or murder. Marcus traveled to Washington, D.C. to examine Dr. Washington's collection, bringing with him advanced digital analysis equipment that had proven valuable for enhancing and authenticating supernatural manifestations in historical photographs. What he discovered in the Howard University archives would revolutionize understanding of how trauma, guilt, and injustice could persist across generations and manifest through photographic documentation. Dr. Washington's collection revealed patterns that had been invisible in smaller regional studies. Supernatural manifestations in Southern family photography had occurred with remarkable consistency across different states, time periods, and family circumstances, but always in connection with specific types of violence against enslaved women and their descendants. The most common pattern involved enslaved women who had been murdered to prevent them from revealing sexual relationships with their white owners or exposing other forms of exploitation and abuse. These women appeared most frequently in formal family portraits taken during significant occasions such as weddings, anniversaries, and holiday celebrations, as if their spiritual presence was drawn to moments when their white families celebrated achievements and happiness built upon concealed crimes. Dr. Washington's research had revealed that the supernatural manifestations served multiple purposes beyond simple haunting or guilt expression. They preserved evidence of historical crimes that had been deliberately erased from official records, maintained connections between separated family lines, and provided testimony that could eventually lead to recognition and justice for victims whose stories had been suppressed. The photographs documented a hidden history of systematic violence against enslaved women that had been far more extensive than traditional historical sources had revealed. The spiritual testimony captured in family portraits provided evidence of crimes that had never been prosecuted, relationships that had never been acknowledged, and family connections that had been deliberately severed through violence and intimidation. Marcus worked with Dr. Washington to develop new methodologies for analyzing supernatural family photography, creating protocols that could distinguish genuine spiritual manifestations from photographic artifacts, processing errors, or deliberate manipulations. Their technical analysis confirmed that authentic supernatural appearances showed consistent characteristics that differentiated them from other types of anomalies in historical photographs. The authenticated supernatural manifestations possessed reduced opacity that allowed background elements to show through their forms, unique lighting properties that suggested they existed partially outside normal photographic processes, and positioning that indicated awareness of being photographed despite their spiritual rather than physical presence. Most significantly, the supernatural figures often displayed emotional expressions and body language that responded to the specific family circumstances and events being documented in the photographs, suggesting conscious awareness and intentional participation in family activities rather than simple residual spiritual energy. Dr. Washington introduced Marcus to Dr. James Mitchell, a forensic anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institution, who specialized in identifying victims of historical violence through skeletal remains and other physical evidence. Dr. Mitchell had been working with law enforcement agencies to solve cold cases involving racial violence, and he was interested in the potential applications of supernatural photography for identifying victims and understanding historical crimes. Dr. Mitchell's analysis of the supernatural photography collection revealed that many of the spiritual manifestations could be connected to specific documented cases of violence against enslaved women, providing visual evidence that corroborated written accounts legal records, and oral traditions that had preserved stories of historical crimes. The forensic validation of supernatural photography as evidence for historical crimes represented a significant development in understanding how spiritual manifestations could serve as testimony in cases where traditional evidence had been destroyed or suppressed. Dr. Mitchell collaborated with Marcus and Dr. Washington to create a comprehensive database that cross-referenced supernatural photography with documented cases of violence against enslaved women, creating the most complete record of such crimes ever assembled from multiple types of historical evidence. The database revealed the scope of systematic violence against enslaved women had been far greater than previously documented, with supernatural photography providing evidence of hundreds of murders, assaults, and other crimes that had never been officially investigated or prosecuted. The research attracted attention from the Department of Justice, which was interested in the implications of supernatural photography for understanding patterns of historical violence and their ongoing impacts on contemporary communities. Federal investigators had been working to identify and address the legacy effects of historical racial violence, and the supernatural photography research provided new approaches for documenting crimes that had been systematically concealed. Justice Department officials met with Marcus, Dr. Washington, and Dr. Mitchell to discuss potential applications of supernatural photography research for contemporary civil rights investigations and community healing initiatives. The officials were particularly interested in using the research to identify locations where historical violence had occurred and to support efforts to memorialize victims whose stories had been erased from official records. The federal collaboration resulted in funding for expanded research into supernatural photography and its applications for addressing historical injustices, creating the first government-sponsored program for studying spiritual manifestations as evidence of historical crimes. The expanded research program attracted investigators from multiple agencies, including the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the National Park Service's preservation specialists, and researchers from the Centers for Disease Control, who were studying the health impacts of historical trauma on contemporary communities. The interdisciplinary collaboration revealed that supernatural photography research had applications beyond historical documentation, providing insights into how trauma could persist across generations and manifest in ways that affected community health, family relationships, and social cohesion. Medical researchers working with the expanded program discovered correlations between communities where supernatural photography had documented historical violence and contemporary patterns of health disparities, mental illness, and social dysfunction, suggesting that unresolved historical trauma could create lasting impacts on community well-being. The health research led to development of new therapeutic approaches that incorporated acknowledgement of historical trauma and recognition of spiritual testimony as components of community healing processes. These trauma-informed interventions showed promising results for addressing persistent health and social problems in communities affected by historical violence. Dr. Washington, meanwhile, expanded her research to include investigation of how supernatural photography could be used to reconnect separated family lines and heal relationships that had been severed through violence and forced separation during slavery and its aftermath. DNA testing services began working with the Supernatural Photography Research Program to identify genetic relationships between spiritual manifestations and contemporary family members, often revealing complex family networks that had been hidden for generations. The genetic research confirmed that many supernatural figures in family portraits were indeed relatives of the white families they appeared to be haunting, providing scientific validation for spiritual testimony about family relationships that had been denied and concealed. Contemporary African American families began using supernatural photography research to discover and connect with white relatives who had previously been unaware of their shared family heritage, creating opportunities for healing and reconciliation across racial lines that had been maintained through violence and systematic discrimination. The family reunification work revealed the extent to which sexual exploitation during slavery had created complex interracial family networks throughout the South, networks that had been deliberately destroyed through violence and intimidation, but preserved through spiritual manifestations in family photography. Marcus established a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting family reunification efforts based on supernatural photography research, providing genealogical services, DNA testing, and counseling support for families seeking to understand and heal from historical trauma and separation. The organization's work attracted support from foundations, religious institutions, and community organizations that recognized the importance of addressing historical trauma and promoting healing and reconciliation in communities affected by slavery and racial violence. Educational programs based on the supernatural photography research were implemented in schools throughout the South, providing age-appropriate curricula that taught about slavery and its ongoing impacts while incorporating spiritual testimony as evidence of historical experiences that had been systematically erased from traditional historical narratives. The educational initiatives helped students understand how historical trauma could persist across generations and how acknowledging and addressing past injustices was necessary for creating healthier communities and more equitable social relationships. Museum exhibitions featuring supernatural photography attracted large audiences and generated extensive media coverage, raising public awareness about hidden histories of racial violence and the ongoing need for truth, reconciliation, and justice in American society. The exhibitions provided platforms for families to share stories that had been kept secret for generations, creating public forums for discussing difficult topics related to slavery, sexual exploitation, and racial violence that had shaped American history and contemporary social relationships. International researchers began applying supernatural photography analysis to their own studies of historical trauma and its persistence across generations, with scholars from countries affected by colonialism, genocide, and systematic violence finding similar patterns of spiritual manifestations in family photography from their own cultural contexts. Comparative studies revealed that supernatural photography represented a universal human response to extreme trauma and injustice, with spiritual manifestations serving similar functions across different cultures and historical periods to preserve testimony, maintain family connections, and demand recognition and justice for victims of systematic violence. The international research collaborations led to development of global protocols for analyzing supernatural photography and its applications for addressing historical trauma, creating standardized methodologies that could be applied in various cultural and legal contexts. Truth and reconciliation commissions in multiple countries began incorporating supernatural photography analysis into their investigations, recognizing that spiritual manifestations could provide evidence of historical crimes that complemented traditional forms of testimony and documentation. The integration of supernatural photography into formal truth and reconciliation processes represented a significant development in international human rights law, establishing spiritual testimony as a legitimate form of evidence for historical crimes and their ongoing impacts on contemporary communities. As Marcus reflected on the years of research and activism that had grown from his discovery of Sarah's reflection in the Ashford family mirror, he realized that the investigation had revealed fundamental truths about justice, memory, and the persistence of human dignity in the face of systematic violence and oppression. The research had demonstrated that some crimes were so significant that they created spiritual legacies that demanded acknowledgement and justice across generations, and that the victims of historical violence possessed agency and voice that could persist beyond death and continue to influence efforts to achieve truth and reconciliation. Sarah's appearance in the Ashford family's 1899 portrait had served as the catalyst for a movement that had transformed understanding of American history and created new approaches for addressing the ongoing impacts of slavery and racial violence on contemporary society. The supernatural photography research had provided tools and frameworks that enabled communities to recover hidden histories, acknowledge historical trauma, and work toward healing and justice in ways that honored both the victims of historical violence and their descendants who continued to be affected by unresolved injustices. Marcus's discovery had revealed that some family photographs contained evidence of historical crimes that demanded not just academic study, but active efforts to achieve recognition, justice and healing for both individual families and entire communities that had been affected by systematic violence and oppression. The mirror that had reflected Sarah's image continued to serve as a powerful symbol of truth's persistence and its demand for recognition, reminding viewers that some injustices were too significant to be concealed by time, wealth, or social privilege, and that the victims of historical violence possessed voices that could transcend death and continue to advocate for justice across generations. Contemporary applications of the research continued to evolve, with legal scholars exploring whether supernatural photography could be admitted as evidence in contemporary court cases involving historical crimes and their ongoing impacts. Several precedent-setting legal cases had begun incorporating spiritual testimony as part of broader efforts to address institutional racism and systematic discrimination. The legal applications of supernatural photography research were revolutionizing approaches to civil rights law and restorative justice, providing new frameworks for addressing historical crimes that had previously been considered beyond the reach of contemporary legal systems. Medical anthropologists working with the research program had meanwhile discovered that communities where supernatural photography documented historical violence showed significantly higher rates of what they termed inherited trauma responses, patterns of mental health, physical illness, and social dysfunction that appeared to be transmitted across generations through both genetic and cultural mechanisms. The medical research suggested that historical trauma could create lasting biological and psychological impacts that persisted in communities for decades or centuries after the original violence had occurred, and that healing approaches needed to address both individual and community-level trauma responses. Therapeutic interventions based on supernatural photography research had shown remarkable success in helping individuals and communities process historical trauma and develop healthier approaches to dealing with the ongoing impacts of systematic violence and discrimination. The therapeutic applications included group counseling sessions where community members could view and discuss supernatural photographs, individual therapy that incorporated spiritual testimony as validation for contemporary trauma responses, and community healing ceremonies that honored the victims of historical violence while working toward justice and reconciliation. As the research program continued to expand and attract support from institutions around the world, Sarah's reflection in the Ashford family mirror remained at its center, serving as a reminder that the pursuit of truth and justice represented fundamental human values that could transcend death and persist across any barrier that attempted to silence the voices of victims and survivors. The 1899 photograph that had captured Sarah's spiritual testimony would forever serve as evidence that some truths were too important to be buried, and that the victims of historical violence possessed dignity and agency that could demand recognition and justice across any distance of time or space. Marcus's investigation had demonstrated that behind the formal surface of historical family photography lay complex spiritual realities that documented the persistence of truth, the demand for justice, and the power of human dignity to overcome even the most systematic attempts at silencing and erasure. The supernatural manifestations captured in Southern family portraits represented more than historical curiosities or academic subjects. They provided testimony that continued to influence contemporary efforts to achieve truth, reconciliation, and justice for the victims of America's most significant historical crimes and their descendants who continued to be affected by unresolved trauma and systematic discrimination. Sarah would forever watch from the mirror's reflection, serving as an eternal witness to the violence and injustice that had characterized slavery and its aftermath, while also representing the hope that truth and justice could ultimately prevail over even the most determined efforts to conceal and deny historical crimes and their ongoing impacts on American society. The investigation reached a pivotal moment when Marcus received an unexpected contact from the Vatican's secret archives, where Cardinal Alessandro Toretti had been following the supernatural photography research through academic channels. The Cardinal possessed what he described as related documentation that could fundamentally expand understanding of spiritual manifestations beyond individual family cases, to reveal systematic patterns that had affected Catholic communities throughout the Americas during the colonial period. Cardinal Toretti explained that the Vatican archives contained extensive records of supernatural phenomena reported by missionaries, priests, and Catholic families throughout the New World, including detailed documentation of spiritual manifestations that had been captured in religious artwork, family portraits, and ceremonial photography during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Church's documentation revealed that supernatural appearances of murdered indigenous women, enslaved Africans, and other victims of colonial violence had been occurring in Catholic communities across North and South America for centuries, with particularly intense manifestations during periods of significant religious celebration or family commemoration. Marcus traveled to Vatican City to examine the Church's archives, accompanied by Dr. Washington and Dr. Mitchell, whose expertise in historical trauma and forensic analysis had become essential for understanding the broader implications of supernatural photography research. The Vatican archives contained over 1,000 documented cases of supernatural manifestations in Catholic communities throughout the Americas, each carefully recorded by Church officials who had initially interpreted these appearances as miraculous visitations, but had gradually recognized them as testimony related to historical crimes and injustices. The Church's documentation revealed that supernatural photography had been particularly common in Catholic communities because religious photography sessions, including baptisms, confirmations, weddings, and funeral services, had created emotional and spiritual conditions that facilitated manifestations by victims of colonial violence who had maintained Catholic faith despite their victimization. Cardinal Toretti's research showed that the Church had been aware of the connection between supernatural manifestations and historical violence for over a century, but had kept this knowledge confidential while Church officials debated the theological and practical implications of spiritual testimony about crimes committed by Catholic colonists and institutional authorities. The Vatican's decision to share these records with secular researchers represented a significant development in the Church's approach to addressing historical injustices and acknowledging the spiritual testimony of victims who had been silenced through violence and institutional complicity. Dr. Washington's analysis of the Vatican records revealed that supernatural manifestations in Catholic photography had followed the same patterns identified in Protestant communities, with murdered women appearing most frequently in family portraits and religious ceremonies of the families and institutions that had victimized them. The Catholic documentation provided crucial evidence that supernatural photography represented universal rather than culturally specific responses to extreme trauma and injustice, with spiritual manifestations serving similar functions across different religious traditions to preserve testimony and demand recognition for historical crimes. The Vatican collaboration led to establishment of an international research consortium that included Catholic universities, secular academic institutions, and government agencies from multiple countries, creating the most comprehensive investigation of supernatural photography and historical trauma ever undertaken. The international consortium revealed that supernatural photography had occurred on every continent, where European colonization had resulted in systematic violence against indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and other vulnerable populations, with documented cases spanning over 3 centuries of colonial and post-colonial history. The global scope of supernatural photography research attracted attention from the United Nations Human Rights Council, which commissioned a comprehensive study of spiritual manifestations as evidence of historical crimes and their ongoing impacts on contemporary communities worldwide. The UN investigation revealed that supernatural photography could provide crucial evidence for understanding the scope and nature of historical violence that had been systematically concealed from official records, offering new approaches for addressing the ongoing impacts of colonialism, slavery, and genocide on contemporary societies. UN investigators worked with the International Research Consortium to develop protocols for incorporating spiritual testimony into formal human rights investigations, creating frameworks that could be applied in various cultural and legal contexts while respecting indigenous beliefs and traditional approaches to spiritual evidence. The UN protocols established spiritual testimony as a legitimate form of evidence for historical crimes, creating precedents that influenced international law and human rights jurisprudence in cases involving historical trauma and its contemporary manifestations. Marcus's research had meanwhile attracted attention from the International Criminal Court, which was interested in the potential applications of supernatural photography for investigating crimes against humanity and genocide that had occurred beyond the normal statute of limitations for criminal prosecution. ICC investigators met with Marcus, Dr. Washington, and other researchers to explore whether spiritual testimony documented through supernatural photography could be used to establish patterns of systematic violence that continued to affect contemporary communities through inherited trauma and ongoing discrimination. The ICC collaboration resulted in development of new legal frameworks that incorporated spiritual evidence into international criminal law, creating mechanisms for addressing historical crimes that had previously been considered beyond the reach of contemporary legal systems. The legal applications of supernatural photography research were particularly significant for indigenous communities and descendants of enslaved peoples who had been seeking recognition and justice for historical crimes that had never been officially acknowledged or prosecuted. Several groundbreaking legal cases began incorporating supernatural photography as evidence of systematic violence and its ongoing impacts, creating precedents that influenced domestic and international approaches to addressing historical injustices and their contemporary consequences. The legal validation of spiritual testimony represented a fundamental shift in how evidence was understood and applied in cases involving historical trauma, opening new possibilities for achieving justice and reconciliation in communities that had been affected by systematic violence across generations. Dr. Mitchell's forensic research had meanwhile expanded to include collaboration with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which was interested in using supernatural photography to identify patterns of violence and understand how historical crimes could continue to influence contemporary criminal behavior. FBI profilers discovered that communities where supernatural photography had documented extensive historical violence showed significantly higher rates of contemporary crimes, particularly domestic violence, child abuse, and other forms of interpersonal violence that appeared to replicate patterns from earlier historical periods. The correlation between historical trauma documented through supernatural photography and contemporary violence patterns provided evidence that unresolved historical injustices could create lasting impacts on community behavior and social relationships that persisted across multiple generations. The FBI collaboration resulted in development of new approaches to criminal investigation and prevention that incorporated historical trauma analysis and community healing initiatives as components of comprehensive crime reduction strategies. Law enforcement agencies began using supernatural photography research to identify communities where historical trauma might be contributing to contemporary crime patterns, enabling targeted interventions that addressed both current criminal activity and underlying historical factors that influence community violence. The law enforcement applications of supernatural photography research were particularly valuable for addressing cold cases involving racial violence, domestic abuse, and other crimes that showed connections to historical patterns of systematic violence and oppression. Medical researchers working with the expanded international consortium had meanwhile made significant discoveries about the biological mechanisms through which historical trauma could be transmitted across generations and manifest in contemporary health disparities and social dysfunction. Epigenetic studies revealed that communities where supernatural photography had documented extensive historical violence showed distinctive patterns of genetic expression that appeared to be related to trauma responses and stress adaptation mechanisms that had been passed down through multiple generations. The genetic research provided biological validation for spiritual testimony about the ongoing impacts of historical violence, demonstrating that trauma could create lasting biological changes that affected descendants of victims for centuries after the original crimes had occurred. The medical evidence strengthened arguments for reparations and restorative justice initiatives by providing scientific documentation of how historical crimes continued to affect contemporary communities through measurable biological and psychological mechanisms. Public health programs based on supernatural photography research were implemented in communities throughout the United States and internationally, providing trauma-informed healthcare and social services that addressed both contemporary health problems and their connections to historical violence and injustice. The healthcare applications included specialized treatment programs for descendants of enslaved peoples, indigenous communities affected by colonial violence, and other populations where historical trauma had created lasting impacts on community health and well-being. Educational institutions worldwide began incorporating supernatural photography research into curricula, ranging from elementary schools through graduate programs, providing age-appropriate frameworks for teaching about historical violence and its ongoing impacts while incorporating spiritual testimony as legitimate evidence of historical experiences. The educational applications were particularly significant for helping students understand how historical injustices continued to influence contemporary social relationships and community dynamics, while also providing tools for addressing ongoing discrimination and promoting healing and reconciliation. Teacher training programs were developed to help educators understand and present supernatural photography research in ways that were academically rigorous while remaining sensitive to the spiritual beliefs and cultural traditions of diverse student populations. The training programs emphasized the importance of treating spiritual testimony with the same respect and analytical rigor applied to other forms of historical evidence, while also acknowledging the unique cultural and religious significance of supernatural manifestations for communities that had been affected by historical violence. Museum and cultural institutions around the world began creating exhibitions and educational programs based on supernatural photography research, providing public platforms for sharing stories that had been suppressed for generations while promoting dialogue about historical injustices and their contemporary relevance. The museum exhibitions attracted unprecedented public interest and generated extensive media coverage, raising awareness about hidden histories of violence and exploitation while demonstrating how spiritual testimony could provide evidence of experiences that had been systematically erased from traditional historical narratives. The exhibitions provided opportunities for families and communities to share supernatural photographs and related stories that had been kept secret for generations, creating public forums for discussing difficult topics related to historical trauma while working toward healing and reconciliation. Community healing initiatives based on supernatural photography research were implemented in locations around the world where historical violence had created lasting trauma that continued to affect contemporary social relationships and community well-being. The healing initiatives incorporated spiritual testimony as validation for community experiences of historical trauma while providing frameworks for acknowledging past injustices and working toward justice and reconciliation through both individual and collective healing processes. Religious institutions from various traditions began incorporating supernatural photography research into their social justice and reconciliation ministries, recognizing spiritual manifestations as legitimate forms of divine testimony about historical injustices that demanded response from faith communities. The religious applications included prayer services, memorial ceremonies, and education programs that honored victims of historical violence while committing faith communities to ongoing work for justice and healing in contemporary society. As Marcus reflected on the decade of research and activism that had grown from his discovery of Sarah's reflection in the Ashford family mirror, he recognized that the investigation had revealed fundamental truths about human dignity, spiritual persistence, and the universal demand for justice that transcended cultural boundaries and historical periods. The research had demonstrated that victims of systematic violence possessed agency and voice that could persist beyond death and continue to influence efforts to achieve truth, recognition, and justice across any barrier of time, culture, or institutional power. Sarah's appearance in the 1899 family portrait had served as the catalyst for a global movement that had transformed understanding of historical trauma, spiritual testimony, and the ongoing responsibilities that contemporary societies had to address the legacies of systematic violence and oppression. The supernatural photography research had provided tools and frameworks that enabled communities worldwide to recover hidden histories, validate spiritual testimony, and work toward healing and justice in ways that honored both victims of historical violence and their descendants who continued to be affected by unresolved injustices. Marcus's discovery had revealed that some family photographs contained evidence of historical crimes that demanded not just academic study, but active efforts to achieve recognition, justice, and healing for individuals, families, and entire societies that had been affected by systematic violence and oppression. The mirror that had reflected Sarah's image had become a global symbol of truth's persistence and its demand for recognition, inspiring communities worldwide to examine their own hidden histories and work toward justice and reconciliation for victims of historical violence whose stories had been suppressed, but whose spiritual testimony continued to demand acknowledgement. The international movement that had grown from the Ashford case had created lasting changes in law, education, healthcare, and social policy that would continue to benefit communities affected by historical trauma for generations to come, proving that some discoveries could indeed change the world by revealing truths that had been waiting centuries for recognition and response. Sarah would forever serve as a reminder that the pursuit of justice represented a fundamental human value that could transcend death, time, and any attempt at concealment, and that the victims of historical violence possessed dignity and agency that could demand and ultimately achieve the recognition and justice that had been denied during their lifetimes, but could still be provided by future generations committed to truth and reconciliation. The 1899 photograph that had captured Sarah's spiritual testimony in the Ashford family mirror had become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in human history for understanding how truth, justice, and human dignity could persist across any barrier and ultimately prevail over even the most determined efforts to silence the voices of victims and survivors of systematic violence and oppression.